The first time Ruth Leary dragged a satchel of rocks into her cabin, two passing neighbors leaned on her fence rail and watched her like she'd finally lost what was left of her mind. One of them spat into the snow, then muttered, "She's gone and cracked, ain't she?" The other one chuckled, flicked his pipe with a gloved thumb and said, "She'll be dead before spring. Or wish she was." They were both wrong, but they weren't alone in thinking it. Out here, along the spine of the Bitterroot Wilderness, sanity didn't always wear the same shape. Most settlers measured survival by cordwood and roof thatch, not by sacks of riverstone. But Ruth wasn't like most settlers. Not anymore. Not since her husband Micah's last breath steamed into the rafters of this same crooked cabin 3 winters back, whispering his final words. "Keep warm, Ruth, no matter what." And God help her, she meant to. That morning had been colder than a blacksmith's anvil left in the creek. Frost clawed its way up the inside of the window glass. The children hadn't moved much under the quilts. Lydia, the oldest, kept the little ones wrapped close, but their breath still fogged the linen thin as a funeral veil. And the fire would stack, down to half a dozen soft pine logs that burned more smoke than heat. They would not make it to spring on firewood alone. She knew it. She felt it in the numbness that crept into her bones, even with the stove blazing. But Ruth had an idea, one that had first come to her while watching Micah build a hearth years ago. He'd told her something then she hadn't understood. Stone holds heat longer than flame. At the time, it sounded like one of those sayings that meant little and less. Now, in the dark silence of a house full of shallow breaths and sunken cheeks, it returned like gospel. She waited until the morning frost clung to her hair, bundled in 2 layers of Micah's old coats, and trudged down to the riverbed with an empty burlap sack and shaking hands. The stones she chose weren't large, just enough to carry in pairs. She felt their weight in her arms, like lifting full loaves of bread. As she worked, her breath came in clouds, and each movement ached, but she kept her jaw clenched and her back bent, and filled 3 sacks. That's when the laughing started. Ned Purdy and Jed Colkin, riding past on their way to what passed for a town meeting, stopped when they saw her bent over a rock pile. At first they thought she'd lost something. Then they saw the sacks. Then the glances passed between them. They didn't say much. Not then. Just a few sideways remarks as they moved on. But by dusk, the tale had already traveled. "Ruth Leary's put in rocks in her bed to stay warm," they said. "Must have frozen out her good sense." That night, Ruth placed 6 heated stones, baked by the fire for hours, between the quilts of her children's shared bed, wrapped in old linen to shield from burns. Then, 3 more into her own, not beneath her, within it. The trick wasn't warmth at the surface, it was warmth through the marrow. The stones radiated steadily, gently, like a sunken coal that refused to die. For the first time in weeks, her children didn't shiver, and neither did she. By dawn, the snow had fallen thick and heavy. Still, the bed steamed faintly in the cold air, and none of the children coughed. Ruth stared at their cheeks, no longer pale blue, but flushed pink from heat, and felt something rise in her chest she hadn't felt since Micah's death. Hope, but the whispering had only just begun. By the week's end, 3 more neighbors had stopped by. They pretended to check in on her, claimed they wanted to see how she was holding up, but their eyes always wandered, to the stones stacked near the stove, to the cloth-wrapped bundles she moved each evening, to the faint heat rising off the beds even when the fire had gone cold. Some looked curious. Others looked scared. One woman, Lorna Brewer, asked outright, "Ain't you afraid of what people'll say? Sleeping on rocks like some old witch?" To which Ruth said nothing, just looked back at her, long enough that Lorna gathered her shawl tighter and stepped out without another word. But soon it was more than just talk. At the next supply run into town, 12 miles of ice-hardened trail and 2 weeks overdue, Ruth found herself the subject of more than just gossip. When she entered the general store, the laughter stopped. Half a dozen faces turned. Eyes flicked up and down her worn skirts, lingered on the burlap sack slung over her shoulder, filled not with sugar or flour, but round, hand-picked stones. "Buying rocks now, Ruth?" barked one man near the counter. Another muttered, "Maybe she'll start cooking 'em too." The storekeeper, old Clem Bratton, wouldn't even meet her eyes, just weighed out her salt ration and slid it across the counter without a word. She didn't stay long, didn't need to, because when she returned home, her children weren't cold. They'd been tending the stove just as she taught them. Lydia had even taken to moving the stones closer to the edge of the coals, then rotating them when they grew hot enough. A rhythm, a method. It was working, but that didn't mean it was safe. Not anymore. The next morning, she found a smear of soot across her door. Not a footprint in sight, not a message left behind, just a black smear like a warning. She'd seen that before, used by ranchers to mark a sick calf, or by settlers to signal a cursed homestead. Once, when she was a girl, a woman had died in her sleep after being branded with that mark. And Ruth had children to protect, so she worked in silence, kept her head down, hauled her stones from a new bend in the river now, farther away from the main trail, heated them when no one could see through the windows, started using ashes from the fire to mask the smell of warming cloth. Still, the whispers crawled in through the cracks in the walls like the wind. She's not right, that widow. Not natural, what she's doing. Stone can't warm a body like fire. She's up to something dark. What they didn't know, what they couldn't see, was how the heat lingered. Ruth began tracking it. Micah had left an old mercury thermometer in a tin box above the door. She used it nightly before the fire died down, placing it at her feet, wrapped in flannel with the heated stones. Then again just before dawn. The difference, 67 degrees warmer. She didn't believe it at first. Tried again, measured by the fire, then away from it, then with the stones wrapped close in the bed and without. Each time, the results stayed nearly the same. Stone held what the flame couldn't. She didn't tell a soul, not even her children. But each night, when she lay down, she thought of Micah's last breath, the way his hand slipped from hers as the chill claimed his lungs, and she gritted her teeth against the tears and whispered, "We're staying warm, Micah. I kept my promise." The storm hit 3 days later. Winds screamed through the valley. Trees snapped like twigs under the weight of snow. Chimneys froze shut, and 2 cabins caught fire when smoke backed into hearths and belched flame. Word traveled fast enough that by the second night, a knock came at her door. Then another, then 3. She opened it to find Ned Purdy and Jed Culkin standing in the snow, soaked to the bone, faces drawn and teeth chattering. Their fire was out. The chimney had cracked. They had nowhere else to go. Ruth stared at them through the falling snow. She said nothing for a long while. Then she turned, motioned them inside. They didn't speak much that night, just huddled near the stove, warming their hands. But they watched as she rotated stones near the fire, then placed them in cloth, then into the beds. And when Ruth turned away, she saw the looks on their faces. Not laughter, not judgment, but something closer to fear, because it was working, and they didn't understand why, and deep down, maybe they didn't want to. They didn't leave the next day. Ned and Jed said the storm had drifted so deep the trail back was gone, but Ruth suspected it was something else, something quieter. They didn't want to admit it, but they'd never felt warmth like what she gave them in that bed, not even by a roaring fire with hickory logs snapping hot. They'd gone from shivering in frost-laced boots to sitting in stunned silence beneath quilts, warmed not by flame, but by those strange, glowing stones nestled at their feet. That night, Ned took to staring into the fire like it might speak back. Jed sat still, turning a cloth-wrapped rock in his calloused hands. Neither of them said much, not even to each other. They helped her chop more wood without asking, hauled buckets of snow to melt for water, repaired a loose board by the door. But it wasn't guilt that kept them quiet. It was fear. There was something about the way heat stayed in that room long after the fire turned to ash. Something unnatural in how the windows fogged but never frosted. Something uncanny in the warmth that came from no source they understood. By the 3rd day, Ruth noticed them watching her work too closely. Jed in particular. His eyes didn't drift like before. He followed her hands as she laid the stones out by the stove, noted the order she rotated them, the timing. He wasn't just curious. He was learning, and she didn't like it, because Jed Culkin wasn't the kind of man who learned to marvel. He learned to take. She rose earlier the next morning, long before dawn, slipped her boots on in the dark. She lit no lantern, only took the shovel and the 2 empty sacks, and made her way down to the bend in the river she hadn't told anyone about. Her back ached, and her fingers burned from the cold, but she worked fast, gathering the smoothest stones she could find. Flatter now, larger, stones she knew would hold heat for longer. When she returned, the cabin was silent, too silent. The children were still asleep, which was normal, but the men weren't in the front room. Their boots were gone. The door cracked a thin seam of light into the dark. She stepped in. The stones she'd left to warm in the stove's ashes were missing, and so was the thermometer. The pit in her gut wasn't fear, not exactly. It was something older, a deeper instinct, the kind a woman gets when she's the last one left to protect her kin. They hadn't left. She knew they'd be back, not with apologies, but with questions, demands. By afternoon, she'd hidden the new stones under the floorboards, wrapped in cloth, layered in straw. She moved the rest to a covered crate in the corner and laid an old blanket over it. No more heating stones in open view. No more letting strangers sleep beneath her roof like they had rights, to what Micah taught her in whispers on his deathbed. When Ned and Jed returned near dusk, their faces were red red from cold and wind, their beards clotted with ice. They said nothing of where they went, didn't look her in the eye. But Ruth knew. She saw the cuts on their gloves, the soot smudges on their sleeves. They'd tried it somewhere else, out in that snow-bitten valley. They'd built their own little fire pit, heated their own stones, and it hadn't worked. She saw it in the frustration in Jed's mouth, the way he tugged at his collar, and watched her crate like it might open itself. They were men used to claiming what they didn't understand, but she didn't give them the chance. The next morning she told them they had to leave, that the trail was clear enough now, that her children needed quiet, that her supplies were low. Ned took it with a bowed head. Jed did not. He didn't raise his voice, didn't shout, just looked at her, slow and long, like a snake coiling in tall grass. "You're keeping something that don't belong to you," he said. "That kind of heat. It ain't natural, and if it's not from God, Ruth, then maybe it's from somewhere else." She looked him square. "It came from my husband," she said, "and he's closer to God than either of you ever will be." Jed left that afternoon, his face locked in a squint. Ned followed him without a word. The children peeked through the curtains, but Ruth told them not to look, not to speak of them again. "Not all warmth is welcome," she whispered. The nights that followed were quiet. The storm finally broke. Clear skies returned, but the snow stayed thick, and Ruth worked harder than ever, not just for warmth, but for secrecy. She began testing things. At night, when the children were asleep, she'd set one stone under the mattress, wrapped in burlap, another nestled in straw at the bed's foot, and a third behind the headboard. She used the thermometer to track the difference between each location. She recorded the results in Micah's old ledger, the very same one he used to track firewood consumption, roof leaks, and cellar stores. Now it held notes like, "Stone number 3 retained 52 gas stove for 4 hours," or "burlap wrap plus flannel, Hofaba 3 5-hour sustained warmth," or "2 stones at base, better than 1 beneath back. No burns, steady heat." The method was taking shape. Not witchcraft, not folklore, a system, a principle, a science, even if no man would call it such. But her precautions weren't enough, because the story didn't die with Ned and Jed's departure. It spread. They must have talked, perhaps out of spite, perhaps out of fear. But within a week, Ruth noticed more eyes on her trail, footprints near the cabin that didn't belong to anyone she knew. Once, she came home to find the latch on the door broken, though nothing was taken. Another time, Lydia found a scrap of paper pinned to the woodpile. No message, just a charcoal sketch of her cabin, with small, round dots drawn where the stones might lie. Someone was watching. Then came the preacher. He wasn't a man Ruth knew well. Reverend Holcomb had only settled in the valley 2 seasons ago, a soft-spoken man with more beard than conviction. But he stood on her porch like he had the weight of a church behind him, and when he spoke, it wasn't to ask, it was to warn. "There's talk, Miss Leary," he said. "Talk that you've taken to pagan ways, that your children sleep on heat without fire, that the dead taught you how." She stared at him for a long, long time, then said, "Would you rather they sleep in graves, Reverend?" He flushed, shuffled his boots, cleared his throat. "I'd rather they slept under God's grace." Ruth stepped out onto the porch. The wind howled through the trees like wolves on the hunt. She pointed toward the east, where 3 families had already buried children since the freeze began. "You go ask God's grace why it let them die," she said. "Then come back and tell me where to sleep." She closed the door on him, bolted it, and began building. Not just stones now, not just burlap and flannel. She dragged Micah's old plow from the shed and began fashioning a bed frame lined with shallow indentations, pockets where stones could be slotted directly beneath the mattress. She used chicken wire and clay, lined the interior with ash-dusted wool. A whole system. The warmth became consistent. No burns, no cold spots. And the children? They began to thrive. Cheeks full again, eyes clearer. Even their hair, once dull and brittle, began to shine with oil again. Ruth felt it in her own limbs, the ache fading, the tremors vanishing. But then one morning, the bed was torn apart. She woke to the sound of crashing wood and a child's scream, burst into the room to find Lydia clutching little Sam, and the mattress thrown onto the floor, the underside ripped open, stones scattered, and smoke curling from the flannel. One of the stones had cracked, too hot, too fast, and it had split, sending heat into the fibers. No fire caught, but the damage was clear. Her system had a flaw. She sat with Lydia in the dark that night, the wind howling and the children too frightened to sleep. The beds were cold again. The stones lay untouched in a corner, trust broken, and Ruth sat beside them, fingers knotted, staring into the fire. Micah's ledger lay on the floor beside her, pages fluttering. She didn't cry, she didn't pray, she just sat and thought, because failure wasn't death. Not if she learned, not if she changed. In the hours before dawn, Ruth rebuilt the frame, added air gaps between the stones, layered iron pots between them and the mattress, used fire brick, left behind in Micah's workshed to buffer the worst heat. She scorched her hands twice, burned her sleeve, but by sunrise the bed stood ready again, and the heat? Steady, controlled, measured, no smoke, no split. It was the first true prototype, and it worked. She didn't tell anyone, but she didn't have to, because 3 days later, a knock came at her door again. This time, it was a mother, a woman Ruth had never spoken to, Anne Birchall, who lived near the ridge and had 3 children of her own. One of them was sick, the others cold. Anne didn't cry, she didn't beg. She just said, "Please." Ruth said nothing, just stepped aside. Anne and her children slept in the second room. The old quilts weren't enough for 5, so Ruth placed one of her stones near the hearth, watched it for 3 hours, then slid it into the base of the guest bed, beneath straw and wool. By morning, Anne was weeping, not from fear, not from loss, but from warmth. The next morning, Ruth found Anne Birchall sitting at the kitchen table with her hands wrapped around a tin cup of melted snow. She wasn't speaking, just sitting in silence, cheeks still red from the heat, her shoulders hunched as if she didn't know what to do in a body that no longer ached. The children were asleep in the back room, for once not piled into one another like frightened kittens, but spread comfortably beneath the layers of quilts Ruth had thickened with added burlap and stitched wool. Anne finally looked up. Her voice was rough. "We weren't going to make it, not one more week." Ruth didn't answer. Anne nodded slowly, eyes distant. "My youngest, Elias, he'd started sleeping so still I thought he'd passed twice. Couldn't feel his toes. Our chimney cracked from frost. No drawer, no fire, just smoke and ash." Then the cough came, and the black under his eyes. Ruth stirred the porridge quietly and poured it into 2 wooden bowls. She pushed one toward Anne. "I didn't tell anyone," Anne continued. "I just watched the smoke rise from your roof even after dusk, saw your children come out pink-cheeked when the rest of ours looked like pale shadows." She glanced down. "They're saying things, ugly things." Ruth didn't flinch. "They've always said ugly things. They're scared." "They should be," Ruth said, setting down the spoon. "They let their pride get colder than their bones, and they'd rather bury their own than admit they've been wrong." Anne winced, but didn't argue. Later that day, after Anne and her children left, wrapped in layers of warmth Ruth insisted they keep, a second visitor arrived. He didn't knock, just stood at the edge of her fence, hands tucked under his coat, watching the cabin like it might breathe fire. Jed Culkin. Ruth stepped out, arms crossed. She said nothing, letting the silence stretch like a loaded rifle. He finally spoke. "You're not just heating stones, Ruth?" She didn't reply. "I tried it, the way I saw you do it. I followed every step. Heat 'em by the coals, wrap 'em, place 'em close, but it don't work. Not like yours." She said nothing. He took a step closer, his breath fogging in the air. "It's the stones, ain't it? Or the way you treat them? Or something buried in that bed? You did something, some trick, or you got something from Micah that you ain't sharing." Ruth finally tilted her head. "You think this is a trick?" Jed's eyes burned. "I think it's not right. I think warmth that don't come from fire and wood and work. It costs something, and I don't think you've paid it yet." She took a slow step forward. "You'd rather keep coughing into ash and burning what little you've got left, just to spite a woman who found a way to save her children." He opened his mouth, but she wasn't done. "You came into my home. You saw what it did. You felt it. And now because it didn't bend to your hand, you'd rather believe it's some devil's trick than admit a widow did what you couldn't." He took another step toward the porch. "This ain't right, Ruth, and you'd best watch who you let sleep under that roof. This kind of warmth, if it don't come from God, it'll draw something else." Ruth didn't move. "Then it's a good thing I never let men like you near the heart of it." He stared at her, waiting for her to flinch, to fold. But Ruth Leary did neither. Jed left with the snow crunching beneath his boots and the wind clawing at his back. He didn't look back, but Ruth knew his kind. He'd be back, and next time he wouldn't come alone. That night she locked every window shutter with bent nails. She slid the wood stove across the kitchen floor to block the rear hatch and braced the front door with a timber bar Micah had carved years ago, back when this place was still full of laughter. She didn't sleep. Instead, she worked. With the children asleep, Ruth unwrapped the ledger again and turned to the most recent pages, where her diagrams had begun to change. No longer just notes on time and temperature, but sketches, cross-sections, calculations of stone mass versus heat retention, flame exposure angles, layering of cloth types, patterns of burn risk. It was no longer guesswork. She was building something, and in her gut, she knew it wouldn't stay secret much longer. 2 days passed before the next knock came. This time, it was a pair of strangers, faces she'd seen but never known by name. A man and his teenage son. The boy held his left arm, cradled against his chest, wrapped in rags, soaked dark. "Fell into the wood stove," the father said, voice tight. "We ain't got anything left but a few sacks of green pine. Pops and sparks. Couldn't keep the heat steady." Please, he ain't slept in days. Ruth stared at them for a moment, then nodded once. They didn't ask questions when she set the stone between the boys' bed quilts, nor when she placed another near his feet. By morning, his face had lost that sunken look. His fever hadn't worsened. They left the next evening with thanks and a bag of potatoes Ruth insisted they take. She knew they had none of their own, but the next day, 4 more arrived, then 7. Soon every corner of her cabin had footprints near it. Her chimney puffed smoke even during ration hours. She caught sight of faces through the trees, shifting shapes, people watching her, and still, the warmth held. One evening, as she stirred stew over the coals and checked the stones in rotation, Lydia asked, "Are we going to have to leave, Mama?" Ruth looked up. "Why would you ask that?" Lydia chewed her lip. "Because people don't like it, don't like what you do, or how it works. I heard Anne's son whispering to Elias, said you put something in the stones, something from Papa." Ruth's hand froze on the ladle. "What did you tell him?" she asked softly. Lydia's voice dropped. "That he should be glad he wasn't dead like all the other children." Ruth stared at her daughter, her eyes full of quiet fire. Then she leaned down, pressed her forehead to Lydia's, and whispered, "We don't run. Not from truth, not from heat." But even she didn't know how much longer they could stand alone. A scuffle. Ruth burst from her bed and flung open the door just in time to see 2 figures fleeing into the woods. One limped, the other didn't look back. Her tripwire lay tangled in the snow, and a set of clawed boot prints circled the back of the cabin, where the root cellar lay. They'd tried to get below, tried to take what she'd hidden, and failed, but they'd be back, and next time, she feared, they wouldn't run. The next morning, she loaded her children onto the old sled Micah had built, layered with buffalo hide and thick pine poles, and dragged them 2 miles through the snow into the densest part of the forest. Not to flee, but to hide the children in an old hunter's blind she and Micah had once built for deer season. Inside, she laid fresh stones beneath a packed bed of leaves and straw, covered them with a thick quilt. She left Lydia with a pack of food, a lantern, and her father's small knife. "I'll be back," she said. Lydia didn't ask when, because she knew. Ruth returned to the cabin alone and waited. The sky turned black that evening, and with it came the voices. Not loud, not shouting, just murmuring at first from the edge of the trees. Then the crunch of snow under boots. Then light, lanterns, torches, moving in the dark like drifting stars. Ruth sat inside with her coat on, her hands resting on the rifle. The first knock was gentle, the second was not. Then the door splintered. They didn't come with pitchforks. That was for fairy tales. No, these were men with faces she recognized. Neighbors, traders, even Reverend Holcomb again, this time flanked by men with axes and cords of rope. "This isn't about you anymore," he said, voice steady. "This is about survival, the community. We've lost too much, and you've hidden too much." Ruth stood behind the iron frame of the stove bed, hands lowered but steady. "You'll burn this place down before you understand it. That's what men like you do. You fear what you can't own." Jed Calkins stepped forward. His eyes glittered like coal. "Then teach us." His voice was different now, strained, hungry. "You don't have to hoard it. Just show us. Tell us what you did, what you mixed, what you buried." Ruth looked at the floorboards, at the heat softly rising from beneath her boots. "You'd never believe me. Try us." She was silent for a long time, then said slowly, "I listened, I watched, I treated stone like wood, like water, like flesh. I stopped trying to make it burn and started trying to make it breathe. I didn't take from it, I partnered with it." They stared at her. Jed sneered. "That's nonsense." "I know," Ruth said, "and that's why you'll never make it work." Then she grabbed the kettle beside the stove and flung it forward. It wasn't boiling water inside, but ash and oil. It struck Jed across the face. He screamed, dropped to his knees, clawing at his eyes. The men behind him stumbled back, startled. One slipped, another cursed and dropped his torch into the snow, and Ruth ran, out the back, through the root hatch, into the woods. The cabin burned behind her, not from her fire, but from the torch dropped in panic. The same dry roof beams that had once mocked her for holding heat now cracked and groaned in flame. She didn't turn back, not once. By the time she reached the blind, the children were still awake. Lydia had them packed and ready. Ruth said nothing, just hugged each of them. Then, with the last warmth of her cabin trailing like smoke on the wind behind her, she pointed north, toward the ridge, toward what came next, because the cabin was gone. But the warmth, that lived with her now, in her bones, in her blood, in every smooth stone she carried in that sled, wrapped tight in flannel and ash, radiating the last glow of her defiance. Snow swallowed the cabin in hours. By the time Ruth and her children reached the narrow deer trail above the ridge, the plumes of smoke had flattened against the gray sky. and vanished like breath. No one followed. No voices called through the timber, but she knew they weren't far. Cold brings out the worst in good people, and these men had passed the threshold where shame could tether them. They didn't see her as a woman anymore. They saw a secret they couldn't possess. Ruth didn't speak, neither did Lydia. Sam clutched her coat tightly, his fingers hidden inside her sleeve, and the youngest, Mara, lay bundled in quilts on the sled, cradling one of the wrapped stones like a doll. It pulsed faintly with warmth, more felt than seen, and in that moment it was the only light they had. They pressed northeast, cutting a trail through the dense spruce that lined the upper ridge where no man dared build. The terrain wasn't suited for farming, and the wind carved down from the peaks in sheets so sharp it could peel bark from trees. But Ruth knew where she was going. Before Micah died, he'd spoken of an old homesteader's dugout, half cabin, half den. He'd stumbled across as a young trapper, built into the wall of a ravine, hidden by thyme and moss. She found it by instinct more than memory. 2 days into the trek, half-starved, half-frozen, they came upon the edge of a limestone bluff, where the rock jutted out over a narrow cut of frozen creek. Beneath it, at the base of a snow-covered incline, was what looked like a natural overhang, but Ruth saw what others might miss: a collapsed lintel stone, the remains of a cedar post buried in ice, a square shape in the earth that didn't belong. They dug, with frozen fingers, with a broken skillet, with their boots and bones and will. It took hours. Ruth collapsed once, gasping, her gloves soaked through, but Lydia took her place without a word. And when the door finally gave way and the earth opened like a wound, it was like stepping into a tomb that had waited years just to be found. The dugout was small, dark, cramped, but it held. 2 walls of dry packed stone, half-rotted beams overhead, and a hollow space no bigger than a chicken coop, but dry, safe, hidden, no chimney, no fire, no scent to betray it. She had no more wood, but she had the stones, each one wrapped in layers of flannel, packed with ash. She heated them by friction at first, rubbing, rotating, nesting them together under thick wool, and pinched embers sparked from flint. Then she built a fire basin of iron scrap she'd hauled in the sled, a concave forge she'd designed weeks ago but never used, shielded from smoke by layers of clay and riverstone. She didn't need flames. She needed glow, and that the stones gave her. For hours they'd radiate, not hot enough to burn, but enough to make a bed bearable, to keep hands supple, to stop breath from becoming mist. And that was all she needed. In that hole beneath the bluff, Ruth Leary created warmth again, not from fire, not from fuel, but from the memory of what worked. And the children didn't cry. They huddled together, listening to the wind scream overhead. Ruth told them stories, old ones, before the winter, before the sickness, before the men with rope and doctrine tried to brand her as something wrong. They stayed there 5 days, living on dried meat and melted snow, heat by rotation, stones heated one at a time, then buried beneath the straw bedding. When one cooled, it went back to the pot, slow, rhythmic, like breathing. But Ruth knew it wouldn't last. They couldn't hide forever. The cloth would fray, the stones would crack, eventually the food would run out. And still she refused to run back, because she had something now that none of those men did. Proof, not just warmth, control. She could build it again, anywhere, and she would. So on the 6th day, she led the children farther north toward the edge of the timberline where an old surveyor's shack stood, abandoned since the last land rush. Micah had spoken of it once, drunk and laughing, saying it was built wrong, sunk too deep into the earth. But Ruth remembered that with a glint now. Too deep was good. Too deep meant insulated. They found it under 4 feet of snow. The roof caved in, the back wall gone, but the bones were good. A root cellar still dry, floor joists still firm, and just enough stone nearby to start again. Ruth didn't sleep that first night. She built. With frostbitten fingers and cracked knuckles, she dug channels beneath the shack floor, stone-lined trenches that connected at a center point where she buried her old firepot, layered with iron scrap, embers, and the coarse stones she'd kept wrapped and dry. She packed clay around the channels, sealed every corner, created a bed not on top of the floor, but of the floor. And when the children crawled into it that night, the heat rose like a secret kept too long, steady, gentle, whole. Mara whispered, "Mama, it feels like when Papa used to hold us." Ruth sat by the door, watching the trees outside, watching for torches, for voices, but none came. Word had spread by then. They said her cabin burned because of her own madness, that she'd fled into the hills, that maybe she died up there. Good riddance. No one wanted to believe they'd tried to take something from her, that they'd failed, that she'd lived, because to admit that would mean admitting a woman had solved something they couldn't. She never went back, not to the town, not to the church, not to the grave. caves. But one day, when the last of the snow melted, a man came wandering through the edge of the timberline. He didn't carry a torch, just a cracked lantern and a little girl with trembling hands. She was sick, coughing blood. Ruth met them at the door. She didn't smile, didn't speak, just nodded once, let them in, laid the child down, brought her a cloth-wrapped stone still warm from the channel, and sat. The father didn't ask what magic she used, didn't ask for her secret. He just wept as the child stopped shaking and the color came back to her face. And that's how it began, not with fire, not with stone, but with warmth, shared, quietly, one soul at a time. They never built towns around her, never put her name in a book, but over the years, small cabins started sprouting near the timberline, each one with thick floors, clay-packed benches, iron-lined beds. Some called them heat burrows, others called them Leary beds. No one remembered where the name came from, but Ruth knew. She sat by the door of that same surveyor's shack for 23 more winters, alone sometimes, with children sometimes, with strangers too. She never had to explain it again, because once a person felt it, they understood. This wasn't magic, this wasn't madness, this was survival passed hand to hand like a stone from the fire, and all it took was the will to pick it up. The last journal entry Ruth wrote before her hands grew too stiff to hold a pen was dated April the 2nd, 1899. It read, "They laughed at the rocks, then they begged for them, then they stole them, then they burned me out, but I'm still warm and I didn't burn.